In early April, deep within the harsh winter of the northern Arctic, the days and nights were beginning to balance out as the equinox neared. My flight to the northern region had been postponed by a severe snowstorm that had shut down both Barrow and Snowfield airstrips. I spent nearly 4 days stranded in Fairbanks before the storm subsided, and I could finally make the journey. Upon landing at Snowfield airstrip, it was clear the storm had been much worse than anticipated. Though snowstorms were common, such heavy accumulation was not. Gigantic snowdrifts as high as small buildings buried our camp, work trucks, and equipment. It took an entire day of digging just to uncover our vehicles. Once we freed the trucks, we wasted no time and headed to our first assignment. In the oil fields, there's never a moment to rest, even after a storm of this size. Navigating the roads after such a blizzard was a nightmare. We were escorted to our job site by a bulldozer, which cleared the remaining drifts along the way. Once there, the bulldozer cleared our work area, and we started setting up the necessary equipment. Before long, we returned to the monotonous routine of oil well maintenance in the Arctic. Over the radio, the bulldozer operator mentioned something odd. He had seen a large black animal moving strangely in our direction. He couldn't be sure if it was a wolf or just a big dog, but it was enormous. In winter, most animals in the area remain inactive. Caribou, foxes, and the occasional muskox are about the only wildlife you'd encounter in the snow. Animals here generally avoid people, but it's important to never make direct eye contact with them, especially with white foxes. Grizzly bears hibernate, polar bears hunt on the sea ice, and wolves rarely leave the mountain ranges far to the south. Still, whatever the operator saw didn't concern us too much. It was something for the wildlife security officers to handle. So we cautiously returned to our work. On the Arctic slope, oil companies employ private security officers, often called the Wildlife Patrol, tasked with keeping animals away from the work sites. These officers are the only ones allowed to carry firearms. Their main job is to scare off large predators using beanbag rounds or loud noises, resorting to lethal force only when absolutely necessary. Later, I stepped out of the truck to relieve myself behind the well house. As I was doing so, my crewmate came over the radio, warning me to get back in the truck immediately. A wolf was lurking behind the well house, following me. Without looking back, I bolted for the truck. When I looked out, there it was, a huge black wolf pacing toward us. It didn't seem aggressive, but its right side was horribly scarred. Its face was mutilated, missing its right eye and much of its skin and lips on that side. This gave it an eerie, lopsided grin. One eye, the good one, was a deep blood red. We radioed the Wildlife Patrol, and they arrived about 40 minutes later. In that time, the wolf never took its eye off us. If not for its breathing, I'd have thought it was a statue. The security officers took a few photos and then tried to scare the wolf away, but honking the truck horns didn't faze it. Even a beanbag round to the ribs didn't make it move. Only when hit squarely in the head did it finally get up and slink off into the tundra. That night, as we worked late into our 14-hour shift, something strange began happening. The equipment inside the well started malfunctioning. Data was coming in scrambled or completely backward. Diagnostics showed no errors, but nothing was working right. One of the crew members went outside to check the cables when suddenly we heard a deep, bellowing howl followed by a panicked scream from our colleague. We rushed to the door just in time to catch a glimpse of a large, dark figure darting behind the well house. Our crewmate came running back, pale and out of breath. He said he had turned around to find himself face to face with a massive black wolf standing on 2 legs, growling. He panicked and threw a tool at it, which hit the wolf in the chest before it howled and ran off. He swore it was the same wolf we had seen earlier, the one with the mangled face. While most of us were skeptical, none of us could completely dismiss his story. We radioed the Wildlife Patrol again and hunkered down in the truck. Every now and then, we would hear growls or feel something bump against the truck. We spotted something pacing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our lights, making us feel trapped. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared on the horizon. The patrol had returned, this time armed with rifles. They were clearly skeptical of our story, but that changed when they saw the fresh wolf tracks all around the site. They split into two teams. One stayed with us while the other searched for the animal. We didn't see or hear anything more that night, but we stayed alert. Over the next week, reports trickled in from workers across the oil field, describing sightings of a mangled black wolf. Some even claimed to have seen it walking upright, harassing workers at night. The wildlife patrol was always just a bit too late to catch it. One of the local workers, from a small indigenous village nearby, told us that the creature might be an aka, a shapeshifter from native legends. He believed it was a normal wolf by day but turned into a monstrous figure by night. According to legend, these creatures were once hunters who ventured too far north, becoming stuck between the worlds of the living and the dead, doomed to hunt forever. A week later, the Wildlife Patrol finally cornered the wolf at a remote site. It had trapped two welders in their truck, leaving them with superficial injuries. With no other option, the patrol euthanized the wolf. Despite being shot multiple times, it didn't go down without a fight, charging the officer before finally collapsing. Even after its death, the wolf's body still emitted an eerie growl through its twisted smile. The wolf's remains were sent to a university for examination. Though it was confirmed to be an ordinary wolf from the nearby mountain range, how it ended up hundreds of miles away, and why it acted the way it did, remains a mystery to this day. In many remote areas of the western United States, gathering firewood from public forests is a crucial task to keep warm during the cold months. Our home in the mountains of northern Colorado was no exception. It was common for my dad to pick up me and my siblings after school, then drive us up into the hills for a few hours of firewood collection. My dad would cut down the dead trees and chop them into smaller pieces. My siblings and I would roll the wood to the truck and load it up. We'd keep this routine going until we filled the truck with wood, usually before sunset. Sweaty and worn out, we'd pile into the cab and make our way back home. The following day, we'd unload and split the wood, stacking it neatly. This process would continue until we had enough wood for our home, my grandmother's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. One particular afternoon, we decided to explore a different logging road on the other side of the valley, far from our usual spot. There wasn't much of a reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a new view. This road hadn't been maintained for a while. Big rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My siblings and I had to clear the way, pushing obstacles aside as my dad carefully guided the truck up the steep switchbacks. The climb was physically taxing, and as we made our way further into the forest, I began to feel uneasy. It felt like the whole mountain was humming with a strange energy, like it was aware of our presence and didn't want us there. Before I could say anything, my younger brother blurted out, "Does anyone else feel like we're not supposed to be here?" My older sibling and I exchanged glances and nodded. My dad honked the horn, urging us to keep moving, and we reluctantly continued clearing the path. We eventually reached a small clearing and stopped. My dad, seemingly unaware of our tension or choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and began cutting trees. As we worked, the ominous feeling lingered. My siblings kept glancing over their shoulders. Everyone except my dad seemed to be on edge. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, my anxiety intensified. Just as twilight set in, my dad unexpectedly told us to pack up, which came as a surprise. We hadn't filled the truck, which was unlike him. He usually insisted on working late to get a full load, but tonight he seemed eager to leave. With the truck half loaded, we started heading back. Even though we were all tired, the mood had lifted. We were laughing and joking, letting off steam from the day's work. We were almost out of the forest, approaching the desert valley below, when suddenly, a blur jumped out from the downhill side of the switchback. "Damn!" my dad muttered as he slammed on the brakes. With the truck weighed down and moving downhill, there was no way to avoid hitting it. When we came to a stop, we looked out through the windshield in silence. Illuminated in the glow of the headlights was the crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling, my dad got out to inspect the damage. My siblings stayed in the truck as instructed, but I followed him. Luckily, we hadn't been driving fast, so the truck was fine, with just a bit of hair and blood on the front grille. Deer were common in the mountains, so hitting one wasn't out of the ordinary. What was strange, though, was how quickly it dropped. At higher speeds, a deer might keep running, only to collapse later in the woods. This one had fallen like a lifeless rag doll. As we approached the deer, a foul odor hit us. Deer don't smell great in life, but this was something else entirely, like decay. My stomach churned, and my nostrils burned from the stench. Up close, the deer was clearly dead, really dead. Its eyes were gone, leaving hollow sockets, and its tongue, swollen and black, hung out of its mouth. Its belly had burst open, with entrails spilling out onto the dirt. Even worse, its fur and organs seemed to be crawling. I leaned in for a closer look and froze. The entire body was infested with maggots. It had been dead for days, maybe weeks. Suddenly, that electric tension returned, stronger than ever. My dad, normally calm and composed, was visibly shaken. His eyes weren't on the deer but focused down the mountain. He told me, in a voice barely hiding his fear, to get back in the truck. I didn't argue. As I grabbed the door handle, a piercing shriek echoed from the woods. Something was crashing through the branches, coming toward us. I slammed the door shut just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was even fully closed, he hit the gas, speeding down the mountain, running over the deer in the process. With my siblings and I yelling in the cab, it was hard to tell if the screeching was following us or if it was just in our heads. Once we broke out of the tree line and into the open desert, everything went quiet. Only the hum of the engine and the wind through the open windows filled the silence. When we finally reached home, the truck came to a stop, but none of us moved. After a long silence, everyone started talking at once. We had so many questions. What was that noise? How did a dead deer leap in front of our truck? But my dad just shook his head and told us to hush. Then he said, "That deer was dead before we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown." We stared at him, stunned. He explained that he had felt uneasy all day but hadn't wanted to worry us. Felt like we were trespassing in someone else's home. As the light began to fade, he caught glimpses of shadows moving from tree to tree, though he could never focus on them long enough to see what they were. After hitting the deer and realizing it had been dead for a while, he knew something was trying to make us stop. Whatever was out there threw the deer carcass at us. Running could have triggered an attack, so we walked back to the truck calmly. As soon as we were inside, he drove down the mountain as fast as he could. That eerie feeling didn't go away until we reached the highway. We didn't gather firewood again for the rest of the season. For the first time ever, my dad bought what we needed. Though we resumed collecting firewood the next year, we never returned to that mountain. The Forest Service eventually closed off the road, and the only way back up is on foot, but none of us are interested in going back. Whatever was out there, it didn't want us in those woods. It wanted us gone, or worse. In the late 70s, I grew up in rural Indiana, spending most of my free time outside with my childhood buddy, Dave. He lived on a farm next to a vast forest, and every weekend, My parents would drop me off, and we'd disappear into the woods until Monday morning. Our favorite pastime was pretending to be pioneers. We'd build shelters, make traps, and even practice starting fires with sticks. By the time we hit high school, we got the idea to pull off an adventure like in the movie Stand By Me, which had recently been released. Instead of searching for a body, though, we planned to walk the railroad tracks, hoping to find cool spots to fish and camp just off the tracks. We knew it was risky and probably trespassing, but we were kids, and the fun outweighed the danger. We found beautiful rivers, crossed bridges that no one else seemed to know about, fished, and hid from the occasional train. At night, we'd camp near the tracks, lighting small, hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened, and the trips became a tradition we repeated often without any issues. After graduation, Dave and I went our separate ways, but we always kept in touch and managed to visit each other now and then. One summer in the mid-90s, both of us happened to be back in town for a week. During the day, we'd spend time with family, but in the evenings, we'd meet up for drinks or sit by a fire outside Dave's house, reminiscing about the old days. One night, the topic of our old railroad trips came up. Nostalgia and a few beers got the better of us, and we decided to relive one of those walks, camping along the tracks for a night. We started early the next morning. My wife dropped us off at one of our usual starting spots, just outside of town. She thought we were a little nuts and made sure to let us know before driving off. Dave suggested we go in the opposite direction this time, just for the sake of doing something different. We were familiar with the area and had a map, so I figured why not? The day was fun, though tinged with a bit of bittersweetness as we revisited old memories. We found a bridge to sit on, smoked a joint, and kept moving. We didn't have fishing gear this time, so we brought canned food instead. Before dusk settled in, we chose a place to camp, nestled in a dense forest with trees on all sides of the tracks. It felt like we were in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep in, but decided to scout the area first, something we used to do to make sure we weren't camping too close to anyone's property. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and up a small hill. If we didn't spot anything from the top, we'd be good to set up camp. But when we reached the summit, we saw an old building down below, about 100 yards into the forest. It was barely visible through the trees. We debated whether to check it out, guessing it was probably an old storage shed or something. There was no clear road leading to it, and it didn't look like anyone had been there in ages. No sounds, no lights, nothing. Curiosity got the better of us, so we moved closer. What we found wasn't a shed, though. It was an old, weathered church. It had clearly been abandoned for years. The building was sagging, the wooden boards were dark with rot, and a cross stood at the top, blackened by time. There were no windows, and the doorways were just empty frames. Inside, we could see rows of old pews and a raised platform where the preacher would have stood. We didn't go inside, though. Something about the place felt off. We quickly retreated back up the hill, feeling uneasy but brushing it off as the natural eeriness of stumbling upon an old church deep in the woods. It was getting dark by then, so we set up our hammocks and decided to call it a night. We lay there talking for a bit, but soon we both heard something. It sounded like singing, coming from the direction of the church. Our conversation stopped. "Do you hear that?" I asked Dave. He nodded. It sounded like a group of people singing. We slipped out of our hammocks and crouched low, straining to hear better. The singing continued but didn't seem to be getting any closer. After a minute, we decided to sneak back up the hill to get a better look. The moonlight provided just enough light to see, so we didn't use our flashlights. We crept up the hill, moving quietly, like we used to back in the day. When we reached the top, we saw a dim light coming from the church. It looked like candlelight, flickering inside. The singing was still going on, but we couldn't make out the words. It sounded like church hymns, but in a different language. We stayed low, watching for any signs of people. After a while, the singing stopped, and a deep male voice began speaking. It sounded like a preacher delivering a sermon, but again, we couldn't understand the words. Then the voice would chant something, and a group of voices would respond in unison. This went on for a while until they all broke into a loud, sustained wail. It got louder and louder, so much so that I had to cover my ears. Then suddenly it stopped. I was ready to suggest we leave when Dave grabbed my arm and whispered, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't see them clearly, but we could make out a line of figures exiting the church, holding hands and carrying flashlights. They started singing again, and the flashlights began to move in our direction, toward the hill. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We bolted back to our campsite, grabbed our gear, and ran to the railroad tracks. We kept running for a couple of miles before stopping to look back. The lights were still following us, but they were moving erratically, as if whoever was holding them was shaking. We kept running in spurts, walking only when we had to catch our breath. Eventually, we reached a road. According to our map, there was a small town about 15 minutes down the road, so we headed there and found a 24-hour gas station. We called my wife, who came to pick us up. When we told the story, everyone, including my wife, thought it was just some kids playing a prank. But those voices didn't sound like kids to me. To this day, we have no idea who those people were, but it remains the creepiest experience I've ever had in the woods. I used to work in the northern part of Canada in the oil business. The work required us to travel far into the Canadian wilderness, a vast, untouched tundra that stretches for miles. In the winter, the oil companies would construct long roads made of ice leading to the drilling sites. Our job was to head out after the initial drilling and test the rock formations to see if they could produce oil. It was early February, and the sun hadn't risen for almost 2 months due to the long polar nights. We were traveling to a well site about 70 miles west of a small base camp in the wilderness. After a week of work, we were heading back to camp to wrap up our shift and go home. At the start and end of the ice roads, there are guard posts where you check in and out for safety reasons. There's no cell reception out there, and radios only work for a limited range. If you fail to check in at a scheduled time, they send someone to make sure you haven't frozen. It was around 3 a.m., but in the land of endless night, time didn't really matter. We were halfway across the ice road, and the speed limit was just 20 miles per hour, so travel was slow. Suddenly, something appeared in the road ahead, illuminated by our headlights. It was a man wearing jeans, sneakers, and a light jacket, walking down the icy road in the middle of the tundra at 3 in the morning. The temperature was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not unusual for some of the locals to be out hunting this far, so we figured his snowmobile had broken down and he was trying to get back to the nearest guard post. It seemed reasonable enough. He didn't respond as our truck pulled up beside him. He just kept walking. He didn't look cold either. His clothes, though completely unsuitable for the freezing weather, looked dry and warm. We also noticed he wasn't one of the locals, but appeared to be of European descent. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed help or if he was okay, but he didn't acknowledge us. His face was completely blank, with no expression or emotion. One of the guys in my truck suggested he might have been in an accident and was in shock. I continued driving alongside him, still trying to get his attention. Every now and then, even in the freezing cold, I caught a strange odor coming from him. It was sharp and acidic, something that didn't belong. There was just something about him that made my skin crawl. The guy sitting behind me in the truck had had enough. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the man, intending to shake him out of whatever daze he was in. But before my buddy's hand could touch him, the man suddenly turned and grabbed my friend's arm. He glared at my friend, then at me, his face twisted in pure fury, but he didn't let go of his grip. If emotions had a temperature, This guy's anger could have melted the tundra beneath us. My buddy groaned in pain, trying to free his arm from the man's grasp. Then the stranger began screaming, filled with rage and hate. It was terrifying. I slammed on the gas, and the truck spun on the ice before we gained traction and took off. The man was still holding on to my friend's arm, running alongside the truck, trying to pull him out. The other guys in the truck grabbed my friend, trying to keep him inside. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, my friend managed to break free, and we sped toward the guard post, which was about 25 miles away. When we arrived, we told the guard what had just happened. He looked at us like we were joking, but protocol meant they had to check it out anyway. My friend's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there were clear bruises in the shape of a hand. We filed a report, and they told us to head back to camp. None of us wanted to talk about what had happened, and the rest of the drive was quiet. The next day, we flew home. The next time we saw the guard at the post, we asked if they had found the man during their patrol. He told us they had searched the road for a full 12-hour shift but found nothing, not even tracks in the snow. He laughed it off, saying it was a good prank, and promised he'd get us back for wasting his time. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that, and who would bruise their arm for a joke? We never got a clear answer about what happened that night, and I still wonder about that guy, if he was even human. The Canadian tundra is a strange place, and that's just one of the stories I've collected from my time up there. I'll write down more of my experiences and share them later. This took place when I was about 12 years old, sometime around 2003 or 2004. We lived in a rural area, several miles away from a small town in Oklahoma. The town itself wasn't much, just a quiet place that most people wouldn't visit unless they had a reason. My dad had a friend who owned a large piece of land, over 1,000 acres just outside the town. The friend always complained about wild hogs tearing up his property. Since it was open season on hogs in the south, my dad decided to surprise me with a week-long hunting trip to help his friend out. It was also a great chance for us to spend some father-son time together. I remember the drive down from Oklahoma City being unbearable. It was about 7 hours of riding in my dad's old Jeep Wrangler, which I couldn't stand. The seats were uncomfortable, and I had nothing to do but either stare out the window or try, unsuccessfully, to beat a level in Super Mario on my Game Boy. The long drive took almost the entire day, so by the time we arrived, it was early evening. The landowner had mentioned that no one had leased the cabin that year, so it might be a little dusty and rough. I didn't mind. After all, I'd been in the Scouts for a few years, so I was used to camping and spending time outdoors. We unlocked the gate, drove to the cabin, and settled in for the night. As expected, the cabin was in bad shape, dust and dirt everywhere, with some raccoon droppings scattered on the floor. After cleaning up a bit, we laid out our sleeping bags and prepared to sleep. But something about that night felt off. I couldn't get comfortable or fall asleep, and I had the strange feeling of being watched, though I couldn't figure out why. Eventually, I drifted off for about an hour and woke up early, around 6 o'clock or 7 a.m. We decided to spend the morning scouting for signs of hogs and finding a good spot to set up a blind. The afternoons were unbearably hot, so the mornings were the best time to be out. After walking for about an hour, we reached an area where the trees were a little thicker and spotted some signs of hog activity, ground that had been torn up from rooting. We followed the tracks into the trees when my dad suddenly stopped me by putting his arm out. I looked up and saw someone standing about 50 yards away, partially hidden by the trees. This was private property, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We had already confirmed with the landowner that no one else was out there, and the gate had been locked when we arrived. The person was wearing a bright red jacket, which stood out in the forest. We slowly started walking toward them, and my dad called out, "Hey, "We're hunters. This is private property." The figure didn't move. It stayed completely still, facing away from us with its hands in its pockets. By this point, we were about 30 yards away, and something felt off. The person was dressed in a heavy winter jacket and pants, but it was summertime in Oklahoma, and it had to be at least 95 degrees outside. My dad called out again, but still no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the holster on his pistol. He approached the figure while I stayed about 20 yards back, crouching down and watching closely. My dad circled around the person, talking to them, asking if they were okay. When he finally reached the front of the figure, he stopped, looking confused. I called out, "What's wrong?" He turned to me and said, "It's a mannequin." I walked over, and sure enough, it was a life-sized mannequin dressed in brand new clothes. The weirdest part was how clean the clothes were. No dust, dirt, or bird droppings, like it hadn't been outside for long. My dad's expression changed. He was clearly on edge. I felt that same uneasy feeling again, like we were being watched, and I could tell my dad felt it too. At that moment, I just wanted to cry. My dad whispered, "We're leaving now." He grabbed my hand, drew his pistol, and kept scanning the area as we made our way back. It felt like forever, but it was probably only about 30 or 40 minutes. When we got back to the cabin, we packed up and left without saying much. On the drive home, my dad called his friend, the landowner, who was just as confused as we were. He promised to check it out when he returned to the property the next week. When he did, he called back to say he couldn't find anything. No sign of the mannequin or any other people. That experience still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I have no idea what we encountered, but I'm glad we didn't meet whoever might have been out there. It's definitely one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. It was late September in the mountains of northern Montana. Fall had arrived, and bow hunters were out looking for mountain sheep. My cousin, who we'll call Ray for privacy, was a seasoned hunter. He had traveled across North America chasing game like bears, elk, and wild hogs in Texas, and bighorn sheep in Wyoming. But his favorite spot was always the Silver Mountain Range in northern Montana. Our family had hunted there for generations, knowing every creek and hill like others know their backyards. Mountain goats are a unique animal to pursue. They live in rocky, treacherous areas far above the tree line, and they're incredibly sure-footed, able to scale near vertical slopes. Hunting them requires navigating dangerous terrain, where one wrong step or a loose rock could be deadly. Ray was an expert in these mountains. It was something he had a natural talent for. He chose to hunt near the Clearwater River, a familiar area to many locals. The region was home to plenty of mountain goats. The first mile of his hike was calm, with the crisp morning air filling his lungs. As he climbed further into the canyon, his breath began to form in misty clouds. The sun was just starting to rise over the mountaintops when Ray came upon a narrow deer path. Thinking it could be a shortcut from his usual route, he decided to take it. A few hundred feet along the trail, something strange caught his eye. A man emerged from behind a tree. He wore a faded denim jacket and jeans, with a small backpack on his shoulder. Ray stopped, puzzled about where this man could have come from. The stranger waved both arms, one of them holding an old-fashioned hunting bow. Ray waved back, a bit confused, but the man appeared emotionally shaken. The stranger called out, but Ray couldn't make out his words. He signaled for Ray to follow him, waving his arms urgently. Sensing no danger, Ray decided to follow, believing the man needed help. Yet no matter how hard Ray tried, he could never catch up. The man always stayed just out of reach, occasionally turning to ensure Ray was still behind him. Each time he looked back, Ray saw the worry on his face. As Ray hiked, he found it odd. He hadn't noticed any other vehicles at the trailhead, So where had this guy come from? Maybe he had hiked over from another ridge. It crossed Ray's mind that one of the man's hunting buddies might be injured and in need of help. If only the stranger would stop and talk to him. Ray lost sight of the man when the trail took a sharp turn and opened into a steep, rocky slope. He looked around but couldn't spot him until he heard a whistle. Looking up, Ray saw the man about 500 feet higher on the rocky incline, waving frantically. Ray sighed and began the tough climb, the rocks shifting under his feet with every step, causing small slides and making it hard to maintain balance. After nearly 45 minutes, he finally reached the landing where he had spotted the man earlier. To Ray's surprise, the man was nowhere in sight. Exhausted, he sat on the rocky outcrop, catching his breath. Then something odd caught his eye about 20 feet away, a boot sticking out from under a large boulder. Upon closer inspection, he found 2 boots, and inside them, skeletal remains. The realization hit him. He had found a long-lost body. Instead of feeling scared, Ray felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if the emotions weren't his own but coming from the surroundings. He marked the spot on his GPS and made his way back down to alert the authorities. When the local sheriff's department arrived, Ray led them up the canyon to the remains. It took 4 men to move the boulder, revealing the skeleton beneath. Among the bones, they found old hunting gear and a wallet with a credit card. Using the ID inside, they identified the man, a bow hunter who had gone missing almost 53 years earlier. Ray didn't want to be publicly identified or recognized for the discovery. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight, content that the family finally had closure, even after so many years. The one thing that kept nagging at him was the mysterious man who had led him to the body, only to vanish without a trace. Ray had mentioned the encounter to the sheriff, but they didn't think much of it. When the story made the news, a few old photographs of the missing hunter were released. Ray was stunned. The man in the photos was the very same person who had led him up the mountain. Everything suddenly made sense. The worried expression, the constant glances back to ensure Ray was following, and the peace Ray felt upon finding the body. That man had been desperate to return home, and through Ray he finally did.